Every now and then, Jesus shows me something from his life when he was on earth that completely changes my previous perception of him. And this podcast is an experience that is absolutely that. I'm going to share what Jesus showed me just a few weeks ago of what it was like when he was teaching in a pagan city when he was living on earth before his resurrection, before his crucifixion and resurrection. And originally, I had recorded this for the Walk with Jesus community and online community that I have of other believers. We're all seeking God, and I get to share these experiences. And I just thought this is way too good to keep from the podcast either. So I hope you enjoy this memory of Jesus teaching because he surprised me. He keeps doing that. And I hope you can take some good things from it like I did. Enjoy. Tonight I have just a really cool experience to share. I don't know if you guys have ever wondered what it would be like to watch Jesus teach. But I have definitely asked that question before, and this week Jesus gave me the second experience ever getting to see what it was like for him to teach while he was here on earth. Um, so I'm going to try to set this up in a way and catch you up. Some of you will be familiar with how this is even possible, and some of you will be hearing this for the first time. But I think we all kind of generally can accept that God lives, he created time, and yet he also lives outside of time, or he has the option to live outside of time. Um, and so what this means in a sense of what I get to experience is sometimes God will show me things that happened in the past or maybe are going to happen in the future. And he'll share it with me in such a way that it's like truly looking at a either a memory, maybe someone else's memory, or in this case, I believe what happened was God allowed my spirit to travel back to that time to get to observe this moment with Jesus. And there were just a lot of really cool revelations in this that I don't know. It's I'm excited to share it. Okay, so can I think I want to make sure I explained it well. Do you guys generally understand what I'm saying when God can show me things that are not strictly in this timeline? Cool. Okay, good. Awesome. Okay, thank you. All right, and I wrote a lot of it down. So I also went back after I got this experience and tried to place it together with where it could be in the Bible. And I think I'm just going to go through it first, okay? So this was, I guess, a couple days ago now. I got an invite from Jesus into heaven, and so Jesus took me up into the throne room, and there was this really beautiful moment where I just got to sort of like lay on the tile in the throne room, and it's very cooling, which is nice because when my head is going too fast, and usually when I get to heaven, I'm like, I could be a lot more relaxed than I am. Even if I'd be relaxed for earth standards, getting to heaven, you're like, oh, I'm carrying too much. So I got this moment where I could just be peaceful. And I remember having my cheek on the tiles. And I just got to lay in, and that cooling effect just seemed to pull any anxiousness or too fast thoughts or worries out of me. And after I got a moment to sort of chill, Jesus invited me to stand up. And at first I thought we were going to head over to his throne and God's throne, but actually instead Jesus pulled me to the hmm, okay. He pulled me to the opposite side of the throne room, and I want you to imagine this. If you happen to be seated on Jesus's throne, and you could see straight out towards the view of earth with that missing fourth wall, that's a gorgeous view. But if you look to the, what is this, the right, all way over, the far right wall actually has a bunch of archways. And these were kind of sort of hidden to me or a little blurry for a long time. They've always been here. But what I now realize is that these are these doorways go to different places in the spiritual world. They go to these different dimensions. They some of them are open to for example, the one is actually a gateway to hell. Not that it's used hardly ever, but it is still there. And that's what Jesus, when his spirit was in hell for the very first time and he defeated everything there, when Jesus unlocked the door of Sheol to allow those righteous to God to actually go up to heaven, they traveled through this tunnel that went from Sheol in hell into the throne room of God. And so that's when I first became familiar with these doorways, and there are different doorways here. And so Jesus walked me up to one of them. I didn't know which one it was, but he did turn to me and say, "We're going into the past." Like, okay, thank you for that heads up. And so I'm not even sure there was necessarily a door, but we went when we pressed through. It was kind of like going through. Okay, I want to set it up a little even better. It's just cool. Imagine, yeah, going from the throne room to this wall that has this archway, but this archway it looks like it has like shimmering parchment paper almost. And so I couldn't exactly see what was on the other side, but Jesus went first. Thank goodness he was holding my hand. And he went first. And then following his lead, he just kind of glided right through and I went after him. And pretty immediately after that, a whole new scene showed up. And one of my first clues that I could tell it was somewhere on earth was because even though I was a spirit in that moment, or my spirit was just visiting, I could feel the dust. There was dust. It was I was just dust. And that's just not something, heaven's not dusty, but earth certainly is. So I look around and it very quickly dawns on me where I am. I can tell I'm in a city and sort of a city square, and this is definitely, I imagine it was some in Jesus's time, because there were these, I think it was like, it looked like marble, like rough marble, like the courtyard itself was sort of made of marble, and then right in front of me there was this statue that was like 15 feet high. So it had like a gigantic platform that was 5 feet high. And then on top of it was this statue, and I didn't really get a good look at the statue, but I sort of figured out what that was later. And there were people milling about. They definitely had clothing on that reminded me of Jesus's era. And over to the, let's see, the right side of the statue as I was staring at it, I actually could feel Jesus, who had guided me here, saying, "Look around that corner. Look around the side of this statue." And so at that moment I can hear Jesus's voice and he knows me, but I don't see him anywhere. And I go, "Where are you?" And he goes, "Dakota, I'm going to sort of be," he said, "I'm going to sort of be with you twice in this experience." And he said, "You're going to have my voice as I know you today, but you're also about to see me at the time that I was alive. And that version of me that you're about to see isn't going to be aware of you." And Jesus also let me know, "Dakota, you're really truly here as a spirit right now. Like nobody sees you." And that had some interesting ramifications we'll go over later, to be spiritually there, but not physically there, and how I could interact with the other spirits there. And there were a lot of other spirits there because as I okay. I didn't know it yet, but there were a lot of other spirits there because this was not a Jewish city that Jesus had visited. This was a pagan city. And this particular place happened to be this like rampway up to one of the temples. Yes, temples to worship a pagan god. And this was a place that Jesus had chosen to preach. Now I looked up in the Bible where it was listed some of the pagan cities that Jesus preached, and there were three. There was I don't know if I'm saying it right, but Tyre, Sidon, and Decapolis. And I am pretty sure that this, because I felt like Jesus was telling me this one is Tyre, the city of Tyre. So, and that was all later. I was able to put this together later. All right, so that's kind of the setting. I feel that Jesus, who knows me, the present day Jesus, was pointing me around, pointing my attention around the side of the statue. And so I walk to the side and see, just like a normal group of travelers, there is Jesus, Jesus Christ, and at least 10 of his disciples. It could have been all 12, but for some reason I think it was 10. And they were sitting at the almost at the base of the statue. The statue itself had a place where you could naturally sit, and so they were Jesus was sitting there and a few others were standing. They were roughly in a circle, and I just looked at them for a second like, there they are. But what was so fascinating about it is I could really tell, like, they just looked like there was nothing godly about the group in that moment. Maybe that they were together and you could tell they were united, but they were tired. They were really tired. And I also got the sense that they had probably just traveled to this city. And so they had used a lot of energy that day just to get to this point. So it's still daytime out, and there's plenty of other people walking by, just a marketplace. Or it's kind of felt, it had a marketplace vibe, but there weren't that many people selling things in that center. And so I okay, as I was looking at the disciples, yeah, I saw Jesus sitting, but I looked around and one of the disciples, I don't know who, but he was sick. And I thought that was really, really strange. And I later asked the Holy Spirit, why would one of the disciples be sick? You're with Jesus Christ. And what the Holy Spirit revealed to me is it's not like sick. He was dehydrated and extremely tired. So he was feeling pretty sick, but it's a pretty clear just go get some water and rest. And so I watched as this group were sitting there and they were all eating something, or not all of them, but they've had like something really meager, like a really like, I don't know, like a tortilla wrap. It was probably just some unleavened bread. But they had some of this food, they were eating it, they were exhausted. And as I looked at Jesus, I could recognize him, but there were differences to how I know Jesus today. And one of the biggest differences was the Jesus from, before he was in a glorified body. This Jesus had a lot less muscle mass on him. He was just kind of a smaller person. Not that Jesus, as I know him, is like buff or anything, but but this earthly Jesus had a lot less muscle mass. His uh, beard was definitely not trimmed. It was kind of big and a little bit bushy. And I could feel the tiredness. That's something that I've never felt from the Jesus right now that I know. I could feel his tiredness. And I knew that they couldn't see me and they couldn't necessarily sense that I was there. Although I think that earthly Jesus did sort of sense there was spiritual stuff happening around him. And I'll get into more of that later, but I walked among the group for a second and sat down that didn't know I was there next to Jesus. And that's when I really got a sense of like how different he is and all those things that I just described, different as he was on earth. And I said in my heart, wow, I can't tell that you're the son of God. I can't tell. I know you, but I can't tell in this moment. And I felt like modern day Jesus, still connected to my heart, answered, that's right. In this time, the glory of God was often hidden. As he goes, in the same way that Dakota, the glory of God is hidden in you right now, in your current day. And that resonates with me because even though I'm a Christian, you guys are Christians, we've accepted the Holy Spirit, there are absolutely times in our lives and in my life where it just doesn't necessarily look like God has infused me with his glory. And to see that was in Jesus, and that was almost part of it. Wasn't exactly a problem, but it was certainly a problem for a lot of people to believe who he was, because he's just a man, he's tired, he maybe needed a shower. And that just doesn't seem like a god. And here he is sitting at a temple of a pagan god, who the image of which is glorified in marble for generations probably. It just doesn't look like there's much of a comparison. That was a really fascinating moment for me. So after everyone had the disciples seemed to have a bite to eat, Jesus then stood And I got really excited because I was like, I'm going to get to watch him teach. And then Jesus lifted his arms out and he made like this circle motion as he was speaking. Now, I didn't get an immediate translation of what he was saying, but within a minute I realized, oh, he's not teaching right now. He's giving the disciples instructions. I was like, okay. So as Jesus was speaking, his arms, he was pointing out, I think, the layout of the square, and he was sending his disciples, you go here and gather this, you go here and find lodging, you go here and find, I don't know, I don't know exactly, but he was sending them out in errands. And then four of his disciples were to just stay with him. And at that moment, someone, after he had gave the instructions, someone stood up really quick, of the disciples. He had been seated and he stood up really quick. And it was unusual to me because they were so tired. How does someone have that energy to sort of stand up quick? And that's when I'm like, I don't know. The Holy Spirit just gave me the knowledge. Oh, that one's Peter. And here's what was interesting. I don't think I've ever had an interaction with Peter. I don't think I have. And he didn't look the way I thought he was going to look. And so the way he looked was he was shorter than Jesus, and he was shorter than, he was either average of the disciples or shorter. I think he was on the shorter side of the disciples, but he was also, I guess the word I would describe is also pretty stout. Like he was like a thick dude. And just one of those guys that doesn't necessarily need to work out, but just has the muscle mass on him. And so that was kind of how he looked, and he had really, really dark hair, and yeah, really, really, really thick hair. And he was the one like, let's go. And he took three with him. And I just think, a lot of times the only imagery we have in our life for this is our imaginations, or this TV show, The Chosen. I don't know if you guys watch that, but man, I adore that show. And so that's the image I'm comparing, is the actor portraying Peter and what I'm seeing Peter as at the time. And the one thing I will say they got right is the let's go, the leadership part of it. It was definitely part of what Peter was putting out there. When I saw the Peter's build, I also heard Jesus in my heart say, Dakota, we named him the Rock, Peter, and there's more. It's more than just he is the foundation of the church. Jesus goes, when you look at him, you kind of think rock. And I thought that was really cute. It just made sense for them at the time. Okay, so yeah, Peter went off with two others, and then only four disciples stayed with Jesus. Jesus was about to sit back down and kind of rest, but all of a sudden, from the marketplace side of things, because there was a marketplace on the outside of the square, this woman walked up to Jesus. She had a head covering on. She was max 20 years old, maybe younger. And she had this covered loaf of bread. And she just very quickly, with a sweet smile, handed it to Jesus and nodded. She said something, very quick sentence. It was some kind of thanks. And she walked away with this like really just beautiful knowing smile. She just walked away. And I understood really quickly what that was about, just in the way that they looked at each other. She knew who he was. She knew that he was the Son of God. She knew that his authority superseded all the other pagan stuff going on behind Jesus, and she was welcoming him with what she had. And I also think that, I don't think she was a Jewish woman herself. She might have been, but I don't think so. I think that Jesus had been preaching, her heart had been touched, and when she saw him, she didn't necessarily want to disturb him, but she wanted to bless him and gave him this bread. And Jesus took the bread, and he unfolded the cloth, or this parchment. I don't know exactly what it was wrapped up in, but it was this really thick bread. It was really dense. It honestly looked a little bit oily, but it had nuts and fruit in it, which is extremely nutritious and way better than what he was just eating with the disciples, which is a skinny little tortilla wafer thing. I'm sure there's a proper word for it. I just don't know it. And so he appreciated it so deeply, and he sat down. She had left. He sat down with this cake essentially in his hands. He put it on his lap, and he lifted his hands to God, and he thanked God for it, and he asked God to consecrate the bread and make it holy. And I know that the Jewish people had to follow a lot of food rules at the time, and I know there were some rules around bread, but I'm not sure exactly which ones. I think him receiving this bread and then praying for it was there was even more meaning behind it because he didn't have to tell her, "I can't eat this," because it's not of Jewish make. He said, "I'm just gonna" he knew the intention in which she gave it, and he blessed it. He asked God to bless it. And I don't know if the bread violated any of the food laws at the time, but he did take a moment and eat of this bread, and he really took it in, and I could see it like when someone's really hungry and they first take a bite and they just don't even open their eyes because they're just like, wow, that was Jesus for a moment. He really needed that. He really appreciated it. And after he had that moment, he handed some of it out to the disciples that were still with him. That was really, really interesting to me. Okay, so let's see. I told you guys that piece. I have some of this written down, thank goodness, because there's a lot. All right. So after that moment, I could feel Jesus sort of like, uh, and what I mean by Jesus, I mean modern Jesus who was connected to my hurt in that moment, sort of fast forwarding the scene. And so all of a sudden I stayed in the square, my spirit stayed in the square, but within like 3 or 4 seconds, a day had passed. And it was just, oh, there's a little bit of darkness. Oh, there's daytime again. And we essentially go to the next day. Now I'm still in the same, my spirit is still in the same place next to this pagan statue, but Jesus and his group is no longer there. And I feel I'm looking for them, of course, and I feel drawn to this other part of the square. Um, I wish I could probably draw it, but it was almost like this courtyard section had multiple areas. Like, there was this statue, but there was also sort of to the left of the statue. I knew there was like this temple area where people actually went to worship, and then there was kind of an open area, then this half wall area, then a second sort of courtyard. That part, what I've just described, is all open air, but there was this half wall that separated the courtyard that's closer to the temple from this other courtyard that's further away from the temple. And yet it's still in the same pagan worship area. Anyone walking past from that one courtyard to the other has probably an intention to go worship or pay some kind of homage or respect to the pagan god. So, Jesus and his disciples, I realized, had parked themselves right on the edge of this half wall. And so they were just behind the wall. So there was that half wall separating them from the courtyard that led to the temple. And I think this is important because Jesus was like, he was out of the pagan god territory, but just barely. And he was speaking to absolutely everybody that would pass through right there. And this was really exciting where I got to see him preach. The way they had it set up is very, very small crowd of less than 20 people at first. And most of them were the disciples. And as Jesus stood in front of them, the disciples they sat down. And they had done this, they had learned how to do this over time to invite a crowd. And it's kind of like if you see people sitting down, like you think, oh, that's what we do here. And if you see people sitting down, you also get the idea of like, this is not just a passing thing. You can really settle in and listen and learn something here like those other people are. So a bunch of the disciples had sat in front of Jesus and he began to preach. And I could tell he had gotten a good night's sleep in and kind of cleaned up a little bit because he did have more energy than the day before. Um, and as I listened, now as I was going through this experience, I hadn't yet figured out that there was a pagan temple right over there. It seems really obvious now, but it wasn't to me at that time. And so as I was listening to Jesus's message, I realized, I'm like, Holy Spirit translation, kick in for me. I don't want to miss this. And honestly, because I was like, I don't want to miss it, I think I missed some of it. I was too intense, too excited about it. But the Holy Spirit, I felt, did kind of help me translate what was being said. And so I realized Jesus was condemning pagan practices. And so I heard him say loudly, so it really did reach across this square, you prefer many small gods and rejected the Father. These pagan god the influence of these pagan gods is quick, and fleeting, but God's plans last forever. The true God's plans last forever. He spoke like that for a couple minutes and he was gathering people, and it's just the conviction. I also realized that he wasn't preaching from the Hebrew Bible or any of those books, and I realized because the people here didn't care that much about those books. There was a different audience. And so he was speaking against their practices of pagan gods. At that point, the crowd had grown to maybe about 30 people, 25 people, half standing, half seated. And there was a woman, a different woman than the day before. But wait, was it? It was a different woman than the day before. But he called her up because she was holding something in her hands. And she was holding actually a very small idol or something, it was either an idol or an offering that she was about to walk into this temple and do the practice and the ritual of asking for that pagan god's blessing. And Jesus called her forward, and he was very firm, but let's see here. I think he gently, firmly kind of took it from her hands for a moment, and he said, "Do you pray to this and expect to get help?" And she had this really sweet smile on her face, and she just kind of went, and because she was so, I think Jesus could tell in that moment, wow, this woman's heart is actually open. She was sort of following just a habit. This is just what you do. Like maybe it'll work. Maybe you won't get cursed. I don't know if it works. We just kind of do it. And I got to say, as I describe it, that is often how a lot of people approach Christian prayer too. It's like, I don't know. We just go do it. I just hope it works. But it's just the tradition, and it doesn't go much deeper than that. And for this woman, there hadn't been another option. If you wanted to get more spiritual, then you better just go to one of the temples, especially this temple. So when she heard someone else preaching a different message, her heart was actually ready, but no one would have known that from her actions. And that's why Jesus needed to stand there and call it out to give these people a chance if their hearts were ready to receive something different. So when she kind of just shook her head no, Jesus just very kindly smiled at her and put a hand on her shoulder and sort of guided her back into the crowd. And there was just such a kindness there. And that was really beautiful. He hadn't necessarily had a convert yet out of her, but he saw her open-heartedness and willingness. And I'm telling you, if if she had been like, maybe, or like defensive or something, I know he would have called out, this is not the answer. But because she had that response, it was open, he was much kinder. Okay. So, yeah, he motioned her to go back. And then he spoke to the crowd again, and he says, I tell you, you won't be helped by these small gods, but I provide the way unto life, real life. Oh, so again, it was so cool to hear his conviction. Another thing that was really interesting about him as he preached, I've seen him like this one in the one other time I got to listen to him while he was on Earth. I shared that experience last year, so it's in the video library archive from a long time back, probably about a year ago. But there's not a lot of, in a weird way, there wasn't a lot of warmth in his preaching straight to the crowd. There was a whole lot of conflict. There is a whole lot of you're doing it wrong. You are wrong. I am speaking truth. And he said it with such conviction that you didn't need to be logically convinced. You could just feel it. Like, wow, this man is so convinced that I am wrong. He is out here and he is saying that. I feel like I want to listen. And I think that was Jesus's preaching style a lot of times, is he would throw out the truth, but he knew it was controversial. He knew his audience. He is directly speaking against pagan practices and pagan gods in front of the pagan temple. And and it's going out towards everybody. I think I'm starting to understand that when he was doing this sort of crowd preaching, he used the controversy to get attention and to get the message out faster. And I don't know, that's sort of interesting for me. I'm not necessarily sure I need that as, because I talk a lot about Jesus, and we all at some point want to share about our faith with others. And that's just what happens when you're a Christian. You're so excited and you want to share with others. And in this day and age, controversy is something that I think it's been hard for a lot of people throughout all time, but especially religious controversy is something that it's hard to look at someone of another faith and be like, you're doing it wrong. It's hard. I think it's hard. And there's another element too where, there's just been so much violence over religion in our past that nobody wants to incite that again, or rudeness, or like shut someone else down. And I think that's what, at least in my experience, in the past, when I've held back before, or just haven't gone into spoken about something as controversial as what I believe is the truth. It's because I don't want to, I don't know, ostracize someone, or put someone out. I really want to bring people in. And yet when I see Jesus teaching, oh, that was not his priority. He straight put it out there, and people were going to respond. He was shouting it out. And when people responded to him kindly, like that woman who just smiled at him and agreed with his message, the kindness, that softness came out. But for the crowd, oh, he was controversial. Um he was, and I also know I've asked Jesus this before, like, why did you preach this way? And Jesus said to me, Dakota, you have to understand, I didn't have much time. He goes, I didn't have time to build the relationship in everywhere I went. He goes, I had 3 years to get this message out. From the time Jesus's ministry started to the time of his death, then resurrection, and then ascension, it was about 3 years. People, that it's not a lot of time. So he had to just get it out there, let the pieces fall as they may, among people's hearts, and then let his followers kind of do the rest. So I don't know. There's just a lot to chew on in that, to see Jesus's preaching style when he was here on earth. Okay, so he was condemning these pagan practices. All right, and then he said, yeah, I tell you, you won't be helped by these small gods, but I provide the way unto life, real life. So at this moment in the spiritual world, I could feel something happening. And it was interesting to be a spirit myself, but my senses of discernment were still absolutely at play, and somehow I could still see in this a sense of the physical world that Jesus was in, but also the spiritual world that Jesus could sense very well. I don't think he well, I don't think he saw in the spirit the same way that I was in that moment, but also he was focused on the crowd. I'm also not sure Jesus needed to see in the spirit except when God gave him a vision, because I don't know, his discernment, it was just so good. Maybe they didn't even differentiate between, oh, you're seeing in the spirit or not. I think he just was using all the gifts whenever the Father said, use this one, or do this, or go here. But I could tell that Jesus wasn't looking in the spirit at that moment, but I could see what was happening in the spiritual world. And as Jesus was speaking more, there were truly demons, kind of big ones, that were starting to lumber out from the temple area. And a couple of them like peeked over this half wall that he was preaching behind, or like peeked around it. And it was so fascinating to see these demons respond, because they actually didn't do anything. They just sulked. They just moved slow. They kind of became mopey. They didn't like it, but they couldn't say anything. They couldn't say a darn thing, because that was the king of the universe and they knew it. And man, I just love seeing his power, to the point that Jesus wasn't paying attention to whatever demons were lurking around. That wasn't important. He was after the people's souls, their hearts, the truth, getting the message to them. Demons were so beyond, he could feel stuff happening spiritually. And I know that because I saw him sort of, like, I could see him sort of shift when I saw something happen spiritually, or like, I'll describe it more as it comes in later. He could feel it, but it wasn't even a priority. He was after the people. I love that. Okay. So, yeah, the demons were sulking, but they didn't challenge him because they couldn't. So after Jesus says, I'm the way and I'm the life, he looks at the crowd, he put a big statement out there, and then he smiled. And it was almost this acknowledgement of, I know you think I'm crazy. And then Jesus said, and yet I know you withhold your belief. And he goes, By the end, it was sort of like, mark my words, by the end of this day, you will see the work of the true God in me who was hurting. Oh, it's wonderful because that was his call. Bring me your sick. Let's do this. Let me show you that my actions back up my words. All right. So from the middle of the seated crowd, the crowd had definitely grown. Like it was at least 40 people by this point. And I think that's also why the demons had started to take notice. They were like, hey, those people were supposed to come to us. And they didn't. And so he was gathering more and more people. And so from the middle of it could have been more than 40 or 50. So from the middle of the seated crowd, two men stood up, and between the two of them they had a third man, and the third man was clearly the one that needed healing because he wasn't able to walk. And so they sort of like dragged him up to Jesus. And I could just tell so much about this. I think it was just Holy Spirit knowledge as he came forward. I could see it in this. The man who had legs that didn't work, it was actually a really large man. It was really interesting. I'm not sure that factors in at all, but I just found that fascinating. And I could tell by the ways his eyes moved, I was like, this one is demon possessed by some level. There's just this sort of like extra wideness and like a bit of a shiftiness. But there for him also, he was like not 100% present, I would say. And so that was definitely happening. But his two friends brought him forward, and I was, thank you. The Holy Spirit gave me this knowledge later too. The friends, one of them was actually Jesus's disciple. Do you remember how the day before Jesus had given instructions to his disciples? Well, one of the instructions, I believe, had been, go find this beggar man and bring him to me tomorrow. Convince him to come to me tomorrow and give this a shot for healing. And I love how, like, it's kind of cool to see how Jesus is, he's like, he's really orchestrating like the ministry. Like he was so strategic about where he chose to preach and who he chose to speak to. And then he was really strategic about bring me who's hurting. Bring me who needs healing. But he had sort of had a plant in the audience because his disciple had already found somebody that really needed healing. But here's the deal, it wasn't a scam. He was strategic, but he was actually going to heal this man. It wasn't I'll pay you to act sick. You know how we hear like there's scam healing preachers that put plants in the audience to get the faith going, right? And that's not a good thing. Jesus had done the real version of that. He knew who he was going to be healing first, and yet he really was going to heal this man. So yes, one of the men bringing the one who couldn't walk forward was a disciple. The other was the man who couldn't walk had been begging. He had a lot of his income from begging. So the beggar's real friend was also bringing him forward. So they brought him forward in front of the crowd to Jesus. And it was interesting because I noticed this man's legs were technically working, but I could tell it was painful to walk and put weight on them. So as he was coming forward, he was like a little bit like trying to get a foot underneath him, but not putting full pressure on it, really leaning on the two men beside him. Okay, so I could also tell that the beggar himself, he wasn't really sure this is going to work. You know, at a minimum, he was going to get a lot of attention and sympathy because he's going to attempt to be healed, and then people might feel bad for him, and then maybe he'd be able to collect some more money. Like, and it's not like he had previous appointments. So when someone says like, "Hey, I want you to meet someone," and he says he's going to heal you, it's like, okay, sure, whatever. What do I have to lose? Not really believing himself. But the friend of this man believed, and obviously the disciple believed, and this man believed enough to give it a try. The beggar believed enough to give it a try. So they come to the front of the crowd, and Jesus puts his hands on this man's shoulders. And Jesus then, I think he tips his head up for a moment. He prays gratitude and an acknowledgement of God. And I think it was like, yes, it was like speaking to God, but it was also saying it loud so everyone could hear. Thank you, God, for sort of like the authority you've given me. I think something like that. Rough translation, but something like that. So people could hear like, wow, okay, I can see he acknowledged God, and then he's going to do something. And Jesus said, "Be healed, walk." And as he said it, suddenly tumors started dropping off of this man's legs. Tumors I had not seen before. They were like golf ball sized, and there were like 10 of them. Some were even a little bigger than that. And this man had a tunic that went down to below his knees. And I'm telling you guys, I'm not gonna lie, it was gross. It was gross to see suddenly tumors just hit the deck. Nasty. Um, but I realized that, so from where they had fallen, I could tell, like, I think a lot of these were actually around the groin area. And there were so many of them, that is what made walking painful. He could not walk properly because there was so much going on in that area. And there's a lot in this. I did some more research on worship of pagan gods in that time, and there were a lot of sexual practices to worship at that time. So okay, so just keep that in mind, because I googled something else after, and I'm like, I know what that thing was that you healed him from, at least in our modern day language. But that drops off, yes, it was disgusting. And as that was had dropped off of him, everyone was more than shocked. I mean, just what just happened? And Jesus also said, "Come out, unclean spirit." And I saw, oh, that demon fled like his tail was on fire. Oh, he did not put up a fight. You know, sometimes when I help pray for people or help do deliverance, I can see there are times where, like, maybe the demon's a little stubborn, or like it tries to resist for a minute, thinks it's a big man, and then I stick with it, of course, and then it has to flee. But there was absolutely no resistance period when Jesus said it. Absolutely none. It was like this demon was grateful to get out the way that it did. It was grateful to leave and not have something worse happen to it from Jesus. So at that, when I saw the demon fleeing. I know other people weren't seeing it, but I could see it fleeing. And as he did, this man's eyes sort of like fluttered. And he tilted his head back a little, and his mouth came open a little. And when he opened his eyes, his pupils had gone from pinpricks to normal sized. And that was another thing that I guess I recognized that made it. I knew he was even before Jesus said unclean spirit, I knew he was demonically possessed, because yeah, his pupils were at a strange size. They were too small. And so so he eyes flutter, his pupils go back to the normal size, and he's just kind of standing there, suddenly feeling present and shocked. And Jesus says, "Speak." And I didn't even realize to that moment this man couldn't properly speak. I think when he had been speaking, it had come out as like word salad if he tried anything. It just didn't make sense if he could make any noises. And so he he went to speak, and here's the funny thing. He I could tell this man wanted to speak with his old speech pattern of words that didn't really make sense. And he couldn't access that speech pattern anymore. And the reason was, he had been when he wanted to speak, he was in a way in his heart allowing that demon within him to speak for him. And it came out weird, but it was weird enough it sometimes got attention and begging, and like, okay, this guy's really lost it. Maybe we can give him a little something. Um, and that's how what he had been used. That had been his definition of speak for I don't know how many years. Suddenly that was gone. He couldn't access that anymore. That demon was gone. Uh, and he looked at Jesus just shocked. Like, I can't speak, but he could speak. He knew he could, but he just hadn't engaged it yet. And Jesus just smiled so big. Jesus just smiled so big, like he knew what was happening. Uh, and Jesus said, "You're without the burden of sin anymore. Walk and speak freely." And I knew he meant spiritually free. I didn't even get a chance to see this man speaking. I did get to see him walking later, but I didn't get to hear him speaking. All this happened really quickly. Like, I described it slow, but it happened really quickly. Like, tumors hit the deck. Jesus said, "Unclean spirit, leave." He sort of has a head flutter, and then he's like, the beggar's like, "What just happened?" So someone at the back of the crowd yells, shouts, frantically shouts out. And it took a second for the Holy Spirit to translate it for me, but they were shouting like, "Demon King, Demon King, watch out for him, Demon King." And Jesus, so quick, I mean so quickly, guys, he snapped back. It's really funny to say he snapped back, but he did loudly. And he said, "You don't know me." And that really was that "you don't know me" was so, it just went so much deeper than it really was, "You don't know God." Like it that's what he really meant. And he said, he continued and said, "A house and I know he said this in the Bible too at another point, but a house divided against itself cannot stand." So and his point was, if I'm the demon king, why would I be driving out the demons? Why would I be driving out these bad spirits? And he said, "I command God's will and cast it away, but you don't recognize righteousness when it's right in front of you." And that's all he had to say to them. And it's also interesting to see Jesus. I mean, man, he comes back at people with fire. Like, I don't know, in my I'm not saying I need to change kind of how I speak to people, but it's so different than how I spread Jesus's message, because I come with like such compassion. Jesus also had compassion, but when people were responding with anger or ego, or not always fear, sometimes it doesn't always have to be fear, but like painting their own biases on it or whatever it is, he'd come back so hard. He is not scared to call someone else out for being just incredibly wrong. And he would also do it because there's a crowd here. He would do it because he knew that maybe other people are thinking it and they need to hear and see him respond in that moment. And he didn't try, for that person that called out, he didn't say anything else to them. He didn't try to say, "You need to believe." All he said was, "You don't even see God when he's right in front of your face." And he said it really strong. So the crowd quieted. And when I looked back at Jesus, I swear Jesus was a little like, "All right, I'm just getting started." It was awesome to see. And at that point, I think he called out again, "Who else? Who else?" So then a little girl walked forward, and she had sort of been on the edges of the standing crowd, but she walks forward. She's got a head wrap on. She's like 10 or 12. And I could tell that she would have been considered legally blind today. Like, she could make out roughly their shapes here, so she could kind of walk around the people that were seated, but she did brush against them a little too close. And one of her eyes was sort of just hazy, and the other eye was also hazy, but it also had like this scar over it. And as I'm thinking back, I'm like, there must have been some kind of pagan practice, or maybe some like witch doctor of the time said, "Hey, to heal the blindness, you got to cut the eye." I don't know, but it seemed, but the reason it's that way is because later her mother stepped forward, and her mother had the same thing over her eye. Okay, so the little girl came forward, and she had very interesting eyes, and Jesus prayed for her. Again, I think, did he no, he bent down, and he put both hands on her shoulders, and he prayed sort of quietly. And I could see, as, within, like, she blinked 3 times, and in the 3 blinks, the hazy eye was suddenly clear. And whoa, she was so excited and just kind of blown back. Like, could you imagine like seeing anything things are hazy, and then your vision clears, you blink, and then there's Jesus's face right in front of you. Whoa. um but the interesting thing was the scar was still over her eye, and her second eye was still not healed, not fully healed. Like, the haziness was gone, but somehow that scar, the effects of that scar was still there. So at that point, Jesus, he wasn't bothered at all. And he looked and he goes, call forward your mother. Where is your mother?" And so at that moment, mom came forward, and she sort of had a hunched back. She was truly trying to be as small as possible. I think that at some point, this woman had, I think, been in service to the pagan temple, somehow, like, really involved. And I think when she had become sick, because her eyes were also affected, or somehow with her daughter, she was sort of, either she couldn't work anymore, or she was sort of discarded as not good enough anymore. And so she had served this pagan god and was discarded because of her physical traits that weren't perfect anymore. And then something had also been passed on to her daughter. And so both of them had just been discarded. And so that's why she was here and listening, because well, she'd already tried the other god and there's no other hope for her in that other god. So maybe she's going to listen to this guy who says he's God and says he knows God. But she felt really bad because when Jesus had been condemning all the pagan practices, that was her. Like she was still honoring the temple a bit, and trying to go and like still give homage or whatever. And so she felt really small, and she was like, "I'll just send my daughter forward because like he'll be nicer to a kid than he will be to me." But Jesus called her forward. They both had nearly identical scars on over their brow and eye. And she was scared. She was scared of Jesus for these reasons, but she was hopeful. And yes, and Jesus, he had one hand on the daughter, still on the daughter's shoulder. I think even before he touched the woman's shoulder, like he had his hand in the air, just like with this much space between the woman's shoulder. And he said something so quick, essentially of see, or you can see, or be healed, or something like that. And instantly they both were healed. And but there was another ailment that I didn't even realize was there. This woman started coughing immediately after, as he said that, started coughing. And all of a sudden she coughed up a tumor, another tumor. And it came out again, disgusting. And I see this and I'm like, I'm so glad she got healed. That's great. I didn't focus so much on the grossness, but which she's healed. But I asked Jesus in my heart, the Jesus I can connect to and can talk to in that moment. And I was like, another tumor? And Jesus said there were a lot of tumors in that area at this time. It's just a lot of people were afflicted by them. Okay, so uh, I'll fast forward a little bit in this vision. After I got back from this vision, was writing it all down, I was like, what is this? And I thought there is one virus we have today that will cause tumors, and certainly in the groin area, and it's HPV. So I looked up the history of HPV. Turns out it was quite prominent in the time of Jesus. It had been around for 4 centuries and it attacks the groin. But turns out HPV can also cause throat cancer, and that's what this woman was suffering from. So both this man and this woman had been suffering from the same virus, and I really believe it was spread by the practices of that pagan temple, and both of them were involved in it. Um. Oh, anyway, that was really interesting to me. And so they were both healed. The mom and daughter were healed. I think mom still had like a scar, but it wasn't like scabbed, or it wasn't angry anymore. There was still a scar, but it was healed. And so and they both had their sight and it wasn't painful anymore. Oh, it was fantastic. At that moment, like everyone's like getting really excited. They've seen 3 people healed at this point. The crowd is growing. And then Jesus, as these two like just step back, the little girl is just like I don't think she's ever really had good vision ever. The mom had good vision at some point, but lost it. And so mom's excited, but the little girl's just like, it was really amazing. And so mom took the little girl by the shoulders and they're both so happy, but she tugged her daughter back because Jesus put up his hands and he goes, "Who else? Come to me. Let's go." Or that was his energy. Oh, it was fantastic. So as people are genuinely getting excited now, like they're like, I could see even on the edges of the crowd, people were jumping up, running away, not because they were scared of Jesus, but because they were like, I've got a friend who needs this right now. And so they were running to go grab their loved ones to bring them back to Jesus. Oh, it was going to be awesome. So, as I see this happening and people are also starting to approach Jesus, I see some of the disciples, like three of them, I think. Yeah, 3 disciples sort of closing ranks a little bit around Jesus. And I realized like they are also guarding him from the side, so he only deals with one person at a time, essentially. Because I could totally imagine in that case everyone just rushing, and I'm sure Jesus could heal, everyone at once, but these disciples were in a way that they were orchestrating the crowd, and making sure Jesus just had to focus on who was in front of him. Well, I also felt like in that moment I was directed to look at what was happening in the spiritual world, because at this point, with three healings having happened, and especially with the sicknesses probably having come from the pagan spiritual practices, and the healing of that's a big stir up in the spiritual world. So I looked around and I saw this huge host of, I mean, it was like 20, I really think like 20 angels having stepped forward, and were created this ring around Jesus. They were so, each one was so uniform, so strong, just God's glory, just like yellow gold glory just pouring off of them. And I could see that not only were the physical disciples standing there, but so were the angels. And I realized, I think I can't remember where the verses are. It might have been when, yeah, I think when huh, Satan was tempting Jesus in the desert. Satan had some really interesting temptations, apparently. And one was either tell your angels to step in and save you if you like jump off this cliff or something, or jump off this roof. I'm not totally sure, but it was something like Satan was saying, like, remove your angel guard or direct your angel guard. And I realized in that moment, seeing that guard of angels, that it was so necessary for for there to be um for there to be when Jesus went on the cross, those angels truly would have had to step back for people to come in and harm him. And that was part of God's plan for Jesus. He was going to allow harm to come to Jesus when it came to going on the cross. Um uh, but I could also see all these demonic forces sort of swirling around, but they still couldn't do anything. And I got to stand with these angels in the line of these angels and just stand with them and feel their God's glory and protection. And it was just so incredibly peaceful. It was amazing. And at that moment, I felt myself getting pulled back out of the scene. That was all I was going to see for that day. And Jesus then encouraged me to, yeah, open my physical eyes, come back to myself, and then write it down. And then write it down. So that was this amazing experience I had watching Jesus preach. And I cherish these moments. I cherish them. And it really challenged a lot of the ways that I would have imagined he did it. He was pretty blunt and yet super empowered. It was fantastic. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Walk with Jesus podcast and got just some uplifting moments, maybe some surprising moments from these stories of Jesus's time. It's fascinating because we do know, because the writers of the Gospels say Jesus did more than what was written in these books, and yet the things that Jesus has shown me may not be specifically mentioned in the Bible, but the stories are so similar to the other stories he shared. I believe it fits in right in with his character, what Jesus has shown me about this experience. If you are interested in the Walk with Jesus community, you want to be in on the discussions that follow when I get to share these experiences and when we do Bible teachings, then head on over to my website, thedakotalee.com, so you can check out what it is to join. You can join it for as little as $1 a month. All right. Have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, and I will see you next time.